Welcome to Talkcast, and for part 3 of my response to the Australian government's reaction to the recent tragedy in Bondi. Now, as I prepared parts 1 and 2 of this ongoing series, which I presume this will be the conclusion to, in a sense, I was, on the day of the tragedy, just about to record a response to Anthony Albanese, ironically. It was on a completely different topic. The biggest news story of the day in Australia at that time was the government banning social media for people under the age of 16. Sort of banning. Some apps are banned and some apps are not banned. Whatever the case, they were restricting the diversity of information channels to the under 16s, promoting some apps as reliable and other apps as unreliable. So, for example, X or Twitter, Facebook, even YouTube, Reddit, these things are banned. Under 16s are not supposed to use them. It's technically illegal for them to have an account or even gain access, I presume, to these particular platforms. But others, like Discord, WhatsApp, for example, they're permitted. These are the ones that are mentioned, by the way, in the legislation. I'll come back to that. But there's a whole bunch, of course, that go unmentioned. And the internet being what it is, it's sort of like an organism that once injured repairs itself. And so although the Australian government might try to take away the rights of under 16s to access certain channels of information, like YouTube, or message each other via whatever means, they just go to other apps because people are making apps all the time. And there's a whole bunch of less popular apps that will allow children to gain access to the information that they want. Now, the explanation that the government is giving for banning of particular apps is online bullying. Online bullying is an issue, and some people, some victims of the bullying, have gone to the greatest possible extreme to end their bullying. If you know what I'm getting at, you can't use the word on many platforms, so I won't use it, but basically they are unaliving themselves, as people say. So this has happened on a few occasions. A few occasions is too many, but a few occasions for young people. So this is the justification or the explanation that the government is giving. They're leaping to the most extreme forms of bullying and the consequences of that bullying. And they're also referring to other more mild reactions to bullying that children have. It's an evil. The children shouldn't be bullied, quite obviously. Children get bullied all the time. If they're forced to go to school, they will get bullied in person. They get bullied by notes being passed. They can be bullied in any number of ways, and social media is just one, but we're restricting social media for the reasons of bullying, even though it's obviously not confined to merely those apps. So this is a kind of virtue signaling. And I'm going to be reacting to what the Prime Minister had to say in trying poorly to explain this. For a couple of reasons I'm doing this. The original reason I was doing this was to analyze the quality of arguments that he makes. And they are epistemologically really interesting because they're so woeful. They commit a number of logical fallacies, like appealing to emotion. It's not really reason being used here. It's not a good explanation. It's more like we need to do this out of compassion. And then he gets himself twisted into all sorts of logical knots as things go on. It reveals something about the Prime Minister's cognition or understanding, level of knowledge, call it what you like, capacity to reason, that he uses these particular arguments in order to explain the legislation, the policy that his government has. And it's a window into why he responds in the way that he does to a tragedy like we had at Bondi. He can't seem to reason his way to good conclusions given an argument. He can't seem to follow an argument. And so that's a reason why he doesn't talk about, as I keep on saying, and many others do, he can't seem to talk about the problem within Islam or the problem within Islamism. It's now been 9-10 days since the tragedy. He spent the first 8 days avoiding the word Islam altogether. Now he's finally said it, but he's saying a perversion of Islam. A perversion of Islam, of course, means not Islam. And so again, it's still hiding the ball when we should be talking about Islamic extremism. There'll be another interview released with me probably just prior to this one, and so I'll provide a link to that and my reasons why, so I don't want to go into it over and over again, why we really need to be clear about it. Unless you can talk about the issue, you can't identify the issue, and if you can't identify the issue, then you've got no hope of solving the issue. So in any case, this episode I'm doing now, episode 3, was supposed to be a single episode, a one episode all about the social media ban. Now, they are connected, and connected in a number of important ways, the social media ban and the tragedy. Not that one causes the other, but there are interesting ways in which this social media ban and what happened at Bondi speak to something deeply problematic within the Australian political scene, culture more broadly, but in particular this government. So let's take, for example, the fact that this awful tragedy happened and there are various perspectives on it. One perspective is the government's, which, as I have said over and again on those other 2 episodes, is a kind of evasion. The government minimising, downplaying, avoiding talking about the real issue. In that context of the government not being clear with the Australian people and the free-to-air media and the usual talking heads and the left-leaning establishment and intelligentsia presenting what happened as something other than Islamic extremism, resulting in the most vicious form of anti-Semitism and mass murder, they're not saying that kind of thing. They're just talking about generic extremism. In that context, you need to be able to have channels of information available which provide a somewhat different perspective and narrative, emphasizing, for example, where the problem is coming from, namely from the Muslim community. Not all Muslims, as we like to keep on saying, it's not all Muslims. Most Muslims are peaceful, but it is coming from there. And so young people who might take an interest in this might want to begin to understand why it would come from the Muslim community. And it's not all Muslims, but there are extremists in that community. Now, why is that? And is there a history of this thing? Can we talk about many of the other terrorist incidents that have happened since September 11, for example? And there have been many. I think Gad Sad was saying recently there's some thousands that have happened around the world since September 11. That's a lot to come from one particular group of people. And we have our Prime Minister, as I say, talking about a perversion of Islam. So in that context, wouldn't it be nice, if you're a parent, for example, and you want your child to have a good, well-rounded understanding of different people's perspectives and be able to set one argument against another, to be able to figure out if there is evidence there to refute this idea that it's generic extremism, because it's not generic extremism. Perhaps that kind of information is available to you if you go on X. Perhaps it's there in Facebook posts. Perhaps it's there on YouTube videos. But if you're under 16 in Australia now and you're obeying the law, you won't have access to any of that. You will have a disproportionate access to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, parroting what the government is saying, and Channel 10 and 7 and 9, these are our free-to-air stations, basically all saying the same thing. A very rare person might be interviewed that says, this is Islamic extremism. There's a real problem in the Muslim community with anti-Semitism and violent hatred towards Jewish people. And you don't hear that often on the mainstream, although it's accurate. You don't hear it often. And now, because of the social media ban, it's actually illegal for children to go out actively searching in certain places for this information. So this is how these things are related. Let's have a look at Anthony Albanese yet again. I know people must be getting terribly bored of this, but we're going to, rather than be overly political about this, we're simply going to be philosophical about this and have a look at what the quality of the arguments is that he is going to make. One more thing to say on this at the moment as well, and why the channels of information need to be broad, and we speak about diversity being our strength. Well, yeah, diverse channels of information can be our strength as well, especially in a context where the government and the media are all, and the intelligentsia and academia are all pushing one line. And so if you're an uncritical consumer of information, you may be getting just this one perspective on what's happening at the moment. One of the reasons that an atrocity like this can happen at particular times and not at other times, even though these people exist with murderous intent, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jew, anti-Israel kind of hate. The shootings aren't going on all the time, but now it's happened. Why didn't it happen before this in Australia? This specific kind of shooting. There have been other shootings, but this specific kind of shooting. Well, everyone's being pushed right now. Everyone's being pushed by a certain zeitgeist, a certain cultural way of speaking. Everyone feels a certain push. And the push is from, again, academia, the media, the politicians. And they're all saying things that make it seem as if Israel is uniquely evil. Therefore, Israelis and by extension Jews are especially evil because of the war that is happening in Israel and Palestine, now over, but the conflict that happened there. Despite the fact that it was an invasion from Palestine into Israel, it has been reported on for the last 2 and a bit years as Israel going too far. And that has a cultural push upon people. Now, some people only need a little bit more of a push from where they are to where they end up shooting Jews at the beach. They're already too far gone, but maybe they held themselves back from actually committing the atrocity until the fact that everyone was given a little push. Now, most people who are pushed a little bit aren't pushed into doing atrocities. But an Islamist who is given the push will be pushed into doing atrocities. Everyone else, let's say on the left, they're not pushed into actually shooting anyone, but they're pushed into holding Palestinian flags, holding an ISIS flag maybe, talking unceasingly about Zionism and baby killing and genocide. Everyone is pushed just a little more in an anti-Semitic direction. And if you're already extreme on the anti-Semitic direction, then you get pushed into violence. Other people just get pushed into saying, well, it's all very well for Israel to defend itself, but they've gone too far. And it seems like genocide, because that's what they're hearing on the news all the time. On the other hand, you get people on the conservative side of politics, and maybe the libertarians especially libertarians, they get pushed into questioning things like Western alliances with Israel. Everyone is getting pushed a little bit further towards Israel and the Jews are bad. Gazans are regarded as victims. Muslims are regarded as victims. It's all fertile ground. And so we hear calls for the sanctioning of Israel, the arresting of Netanyahu, more BDS and all that stuff. And all of that also pushes people into minimizing when actual tragedy happens. After Bondi, within 48 hours, you hear people say things like, don't politicize this. But at the same time, it's not religion. It's more to do with politics. All these ways of minimizing. It's sloppy thinking. It's very sloppy thinking, especially from our government. And as I say, on the world stage, they've wanted to have some sort of relevance. They've wanted to be world leading. They wanted to be world leading on recognizing Palestine as a state. They wanted to be up there as one of the first to say we're with Palestine, rather than with their natural ally, Israel. Natural ally because we're both of the West and of the Enlightenment. Okay, so without further ado, let's listen to this interview between a Channel 7 free-to-air news reporter and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
Prime Minister, thanks for joining 7 News.
Good to be with you, Mark.
Will this save lives?
Yes, it will. And this is a reform that has come from the grassroots. I've met in this very room with parents who've had to farewell their young sons or daughters.
So that classic appeal to emotion. This will save lives. I mean, how much more extreme can you get with that than that? We're going to censor this, stop people accessing parts of the internet, because if they do so, it's deadly. Your child might die. I've already had to, speak to people who had to farewell their own children. We could mount this argument for any number of things which contain a certain hazard. We could talk about sport. Every weekend, children engage in sports where some small number, however small, each year, die. People playing full contact rugby league, for example. They can hit their head, they can die, they can be severely injured. Every year there are many, many injuries due to sport. We don't ban sports. More telling, on the roads, every year, large numbers of children are killed. By large, I mean compared to other causes of death. Killed and severely injured. But we don't say children are not allowed to travel on the roads, whether by car or bus or ride bikes or even walk as a pedestrian. Those are hazardous things to do, but we accept the dangers. We understand and we're trying to make them more safe. The idea of banning has many side effects, which I guess the Prime Minister doesn't intend, but he wants to be seen to be doing something, to be world leading. What effect it will have, of course, to the under-16s who aren't permitted to use, for example, YouTube and X and Facebook and Reddit and Instagram, all these things, under the age of 16 is now they are at a disadvantage compared to their peers around the world. So this might be world leading, as the Prime Minister will come back to, a world leading piece of legislation, but it's leading young people into a technological abyss, if you like, where they will not know what the memes are, the culture is, and the information that is available on these other platforms if they're obeying the law. We have to presume that many of them won't. They'll be using VPNs. They'll otherwise gain access to the platforms anyway, regardless. But if you're a good boy or a good girl, obeying the law, obeying the rules, obeying your parents, obeying your school and so on, you will be at a disadvantage, certainly career-wise. You're going to have to catch up in some way, shape or form, especially in those industries where it would just be assumed that you would know exactly how to use all of these social media platforms. In our future, no one can guess at, but where one might imagine some of these platforms will still dominate the channels of information that people use in order to consume news and interact with each other. So if you're an employer anywhere around the world and you've got two otherwise equal people sitting before you and you need someone who's highly proficient with social media, and one of them is an Australian, you might very well be thinking to yourself, Australians are a little bit backward when it comes to all this stuff. I think I'll stick with the Indian. I think I'll stick with the Chinese person, the American, the British person, because maybe not the British, because those people are, have great proficiency, have great skill in using social media, but the Australians, not anymore. And also the Australians might very well be ignorant of the world in a way that other people aren't. You might reason that because, hey, they only read the information that has managed to make its way through the eSafety Commissioner, the censor, the communications minister, whatever is deemed to be correct and a correct type of platform. And speaking of correct, of course, comparing information from one platform to another allows for more rapid error identification and correction. And as a child or as a young person under the age of 16, you now can't compare what you're reading in one place, let's say on the ABC, to another place, let's say like on YouTube or on X. So your critical thinking skills, your capacity to evaluate is already being stymied by government legislation. Let's keep going.
And those tragedies, every one of them is one too many. What this will do is protect children and allow them to be children, give parents the authority to speak with their children and say, well, this is the law, we need to comply with it, and to stop that peer group pressure of young Mary saying, I need to be on this device and on this platform because my friend Rebecca is on it.
I don't understand this idea of it gives parents the authority to talk to their children. Parents have that authority to talk to their children about anything. It actually takes away parental authority and places it into the hands of the government. So the parent actually doesn't have the authority anymore to say, okay, Johnny, if you want to use YouTube, you can. That's illegal. And other politicians have asked during interviews, rhetorically, I suppose. Matt Canavan was one, who's a national senator, who was asking out loud, I think he asked in Senate estimates, which is where the senators get to question the bureaucrats and other politicians. And I think he actually did ask the bureaucrat, if I used my account to give access to my son, or not just that, if my son used my account without my knowledge to gain access to the internet, what might happen? And the response was, well, YouTube or Google or whoever controls that account may very well take your account away. And so Matt Canavan, the adult, said, well, so I, as the adult, could indeed be punished, have my privileges for the use of certain platforms taken away if my son was to use my account in order to gain access to the platform.
I've gotten to know a very successful, amazing young Australian called Leo Pugliese. He's established an online news platform known now as 6 News. He set that up when he was 11, and he set it up on YouTube, or Twitter then. I'm just trying to understand, as it comes next week or the next couple of weeks, would an 11-year-old now be able to do what Leo did and set up a political news, current affairs platform on social media and become as successful as he has over the past 15 odd years?
I mean, again, this was a bill passed by Parliament, and I'm not sure how much consideration had been given to that. I
agree with you.
I would have thought, he's a pretty amazing individual and had a lot of runway. I do think there may be some exceptions if, say, it is a parent-run account. I guess the one feature of this is that the onus falls on the platforms themselves. They're not allowed to host.
I don't want to hold the thing. I'm sorry if I okay, because I just don't want to hold the committee up. So are you saying that a parent could sign up the account, and then their 11-year-old child could do the video, because he was presenting to screen that. He's sort of a presenter who does interviews. He interviewed the Prime Minister when I think he was 13 or 14 or something. So if they're using their dad's or mum's account, can they legally go on and produce video content?
Well, there won't be any legal repercussions for young people or parents who...
No, okay. Would I suppose, maybe if we try and get to the point as much as possible, would Google be obligated in that case to take down those videos or to shut down that account if they find that a 12-year-old kid is using their parents' account to post video content on political affairs or current affairs?
I think it will depend, Senator, on who holds the account, because that's the obligation. The obligation relates to the having of the account by the individual. If it's held by business, that wouldn't be captured. If it's held by the parent, that wouldn't be captured.
It would be captured. So Google would have an obligation to shut that account down.
Wouldn't be captured. So held by a business or by a parent, that wouldn't be captured.
So Google could allow content that the young person has recorded and uploaded, and they're using social media then, aren't they? And they're interacting online with comments. I mean, presumably people then would comment on the video. Isn't that what you're trying to ban?
I think it will depend on the individual circumstances. It will be a matter for the platforms to assess who they think actually is holding the account. But I can see that there would be ways where a parent or a business could be the person uploading the videos, for example. So a young person could interview the Prime Minister, and their parents could post that up onto a particular account. the harms are obviously around the actual interaction. So it would be a matter for, I guess, the platform and the parents in how they might manage such an account.
I think I agree with the eSafety Commissioner's original comment there that maybe we should have thought about this stuff. In fact, I recommended this very thing in my dissenting report, that we should look at exemptions for news reporting, educational purposes, etc. Anyway, moving on. The other question I wanted to ask is on behalf of my children. I don't know why YouTube's been captured. I mean, I've had some great family experiences on YouTube. We all hung out for part 3 of the Punic Wars of Oversimplified series. We watched that all together as a family. Most of my kids now are massively into Roman history. One child's studying rocket science, basically because he got to learn that through YouTube. And that was through the algorithm, right? He starts, researching rockets, and the algorithm leads him to MIT lectures. And now he's studying that as an adult. I don't understand. I mean, I get there's maybe some harm, but I feel like you haven't fully captured the positive benefits, including of the algorithm, because the algorithm takes an interest in history and politics, in science, and shows you more interesting content. There's some positive elements of that, aren't there?
Yeah. Well, some of our research did show that 96% of 10 to 15-year-olds had one social media account, and 70% of them experienced harm on social media, and 40% of those experienced the most harm.
I'm just talking about YouTube, just because.
Okay, I'm talking 40% experienced it on YouTube. I just want to read you something from YouTube's own research. YouTube stickiness is caused by the interactive nature of our platform. Videos are initially used for quick mood management but result in excessive viewing. Excessive viewing, video watching, is related to addiction. YouTube users control what they want to watch, which keeps them on the platform longer. Video watching encourages a sedentary lifestyle. Poor posture and body aches are also a result of excessive video watching. Overexposure to video leads to decreased attention spans. Easy access to web reduces critical thinking skills. Blue light from screens causes sleep deprivation, ultimately affects the brain's mental processing. Users rely on videos and social media for companionship, leads to social isolation. Gaming content on YouTube is sought out by inappropriately aged children. Teens are strongly influenced by YouTube creators. Young adults suffer anxiety from FOMO, and there is an increasing number of children in therapy after watching YouTube.
So just to go back to what we said earlier, children can continue to do all of that on their parents' account?
They can look at YouTube videos in a logged out state.
Yeah, or even on their parents' account?
I think if they were, Senator, I think if they were doing that on a parent's account, we would expect that Google would assess that.
So they'd block my account? So if I was allowing my child, as a parent, to use my account to look at content, they'd block my account?
They may
assess
you're going to restrict
the rights of their parents.
The user of the account is underage.
What a nightmare. Yeah, okay. All right, I'll not delay the committee any longer, but no, there's no longer parental rights in this country. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Canavan. Senator Smith.
That appears to be what's going on. So this is not like it is confined to the under-16s. It affects adults as well. Any adult who, for whatever reason, has their account used by a child could very well be in breach of the platform's policies now, as well as the government legislation.
And so this is world leading, but it's really common sense.
World leading common sense. It loves to be world leading. As I say, this government is very, very juvenile. They want to be noticed. Look at me, look at me, look at me. I don't know why they need to do this. It's as if he's been elected Prime Minister, but it's not good enough for him. And this happens very often on the left side of Australian politics. They don't see being in government in Australia enough. They want to be at the UN. They want to be in the World Economic Forum. They want to be elected to a supranational body. They want to be world leading. So he wants to be able to put this legislation in so he can go off to the UN, as he did, and then announce it and have Keir Starmer praise him and then have other people say, how's it going over there? Regardless of whether or not it works at all, he wants to be world leading. Now, of course, you can be world leading in inflation. You can be world leading in censorship. You can be world leading in imprisoning political dissidents like China. There's a lot of ways to be world leading. World leading is a completely philosophically neutral term. It doesn't tell you whether or not the thing you're leading the world in is good or bad. But this is the quality of the arguments used by this Prime Minister and this government. It's very shallow.
What are those parents that you've had in this room discussing the loss of their child told you that's moved you?
That they're heartbroken, and that for many of them, they simply weren't aware of what their child was going through.
Appeal to emotion, appeal to anecdote, appeal to extreme data points, but not statistics. Statistics would be one thing. If it was the case that 30% of all under-16s who ever used YouTube were found to be committing the worst possible act on their lives that they could, or if they were self-harming, or name your particular tragic circumstance with a young person. If that was the case, then maybe we'd have something to talk about. But this is extremely isolated to numbers approximating or less than the number of injuries and deaths that one might get due to playing sport each weekend, or going swimming at the beach. We have a number of drownings every single year here in Australia, people caught in rips, and especially young people as well. We don't go banning the beach. We put flags down, we warn people as much as they can, we educate people, we teach them to swim, that sort of thing. We could teach people to use social media reliably, and schools and other government organisations have these sort of programs in place. What banning does is, of course, it prevents a person from learning to use a platform in a responsible way and in a resilient way. Having a conversation with a child about how, if you're bullied on Facebook, you're bullied on Instagram, or you're bullied on Reddit or X or YouTube or whatever it happens to be, here are some strategies about how to deal with this. Here's what you can do. That's a useful thing. That gives knowledge. Banning it means that you are coddled. You're being held in a place where you cannot develop the skills that one would normally develop in order to deal with bullying of that kind. But you're going to be thrown into the deep end eventually anyway. It's just that you'll be singularly more unprepared than what you might otherwise have been if you'd been using it, ever since, from 12 to 16 or something. You've got 4 years worth of learning how to navigate the social vagaries of these particular platforms. No doubt there have been instances of bullying which have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with these platforms, but which have caused severe psychological distress of the worst kind in children. And that has been going on for many generations. Of course, playgrounds exist, and they are bastions of bullying. And maybe we should ban schools. That's another thing. This is where most bullying happens, is at schools. People forced into communities with their peers that they don't want to be in, sharing carpet for hours upon hour, day after day, year upon year, with people they don't like and have nothing in common with but their age. This is a telling remark that he's about to make.
The fact that we have so much bullying, the fact that when a child is in their room, when we were young, Mark, our parents knew what we were up to.
Mostly outside, they couldn't get us in the house.
Indeed.
That was the thing.
The weird irony there, the quality of the argument, the analysis. No, I don't know how much of the audience is thinking critically about this. On the one hand, he says, we're doing this because parents don't know where their children are, what they're up to. They're in their room. So you do know where they are. They're in their room. What he means, of course, is they don't know what the child is doing on the device. Okay, children are allowed to have some privacy. And if the relationship is there, then the child, if they get bullied, should be able to communicate with the parents. They then segue into, when we were young, Mark, says Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister's little reporter, when we were young, our parents, knew where we were. And then Mark, the reporter, says, we were outside. No, so it's exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. When I was younger, just as the Prime Minister and this reporter, your parents quite often had absolutely no clue where you were. There were no mobile phones. There was no GPS. There was no tracking. There was no way that your parents could get in contact with you. They did not know where you were. You were outside. In my case, you were often riding your bike in the bushland somewhere or other, mountain biking. Other people would go off to the beach, to a friend's house. Your parents didn't know where you were. They had no clue unless you told them. These days, we know there is a massive surveillance network. Any parent whose child has a mobile phone usually can use, the Find My or the Track My Child sort of thing, and many parents do, often for good reason. So you know exactly where the child is, but because the child has a device. Now, if the child has a device and they're also in their bedroom, you know exactly where they are. And you can also know what they're up to if you have that relationship with your child. So this argument that, somehow parents in the past knew exactly what their children were up to is completely false. These days, it's quite the reverse. Parents do know exactly what their children are up to for the most part. And if they don't and they're worried, they should ask. Why not have that conversation? And for those children who don't have the relationship with their parents where they can tell them what they're up to, what they're doing, this legislation isn't going to help, because they're exactly the kind of children who will circumvent the legislation by using VPNs, by using other apps, or just logging in under a false name, which is happening.
And now when you see that powerful British fiction, but based on reality, adolescence, that really tells a story of heartbreak as well, and the mental health issues that have been associated with new technology that can be terrific.
Again, this is the quality of the argument. He didn't quite go full Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer in Parliament and in interviews referred repeatedly to the fictional Netflix television show called Adolescence, which is about bullying. He referred to it as a documentary. At least the Prime Minister of Australia here didn't refer to it as a documentary. He referred to it as a fictional story based upon fact. What fact? Why don't we talk about the facts? We don't need to talk about the fictional story. Talk about the facts. You can't base policy on a Netflix drama. I mean, it's absurd. If he's making policy, at least in part by his own admission, on the watching of a Netflix documentary, Adolescence, about bullying, what next? Health policy on the basis of House MD? Space policy on the basis of Star Trek? Technology policy on the basis of the Terminator? Possibly he will. This is not serious from a government. It's not serious, and it's not taking the public seriously. It's kind of saying, you watched Netflix too, didn't you? Weren't you upset about that? People can be radicalized and start bullying others if they go online. Therefore, we're banning it because a Netflix drama scared me.
But we need to make sure that humans are in control.
The social media giants don't seem to be scared of governments. They think they're bigger than governments, more powerful than governments. What's your message to them?
This is Mark Riley. Okay, so softball interview, but just typical tropes. Which social media company thinks they're bigger than nations? The way he talks about, he's so anti-business, anti-corporation. I don't know who he's talking about. These big companies, as many people have observed, are not in charge of courts. They're not in charge of governments. They don't control police or militaries. They're businesses. They don't think they're bigger than nations. They don't think they don't have to listen to governments. In fact, exactly the opposite. They are desperate to try and comply. I've said since this came in, although it would be terrible personally for me, because much of what I do depends upon me having access to YouTube and to X and to various social media platforms. That's likely where you're watching this now. So it would do me great harm to have these companies leave Australia. But I've argued perhaps they should, at least for a while, to teach our government a lesson. But precisely because they do listen to governments, they just remain within the country and attempt to comply at great cost to themselves, with the legislation, the absurd legislation, the one-sided legislation, the biased legislation that selects particular platforms that they regard and the bureaucrats regard as somewhat more conservative or not fully on board with the left-wing ideology. Let's keep going and listen to the anti-corporation, anti-business, anti-capitalism rant from these two.
That they have a social responsibility and they need a social licence as well. And Australians are saying, we are determined for this to happen. And this has support right across the Parliament. And that reflects a concern that is being discussed outside every school, on the sidelines of every footy or netball game, the concern that parents are having in discussions they're having with their families around the kitchen table.
To be fair, I think he's quite right. I think it is a majority of Australians who support this kind of legislation. They just want something done. It was disappointing during COVID, and the only explanation I had was that we were supine, completely and utterly impotent in the face of what I regarded as government overreach. The government, as many people have said, when COVID happened, rather than stick with existing plans that were already in place, and Lord Daniel Hannan talked about this quite eloquently when I spoke to him for the Conjecture Institute as well, governments around the world had pandemic responses. They had war gamed this. They had thought through what should be done. But what they did instead was, instead of following their own playbook, they copied the communist Chinese model of locking people down, locking people in their houses, not allowing the fit and healthy to go out and sheltering the more vulnerable. And what we saw in Australian culture at that time was a culture not merely of compliance, which, okay, that's fair enough, but dobbing and people reporting their neighbours to the police and to others. They became curtain twitchers. They became very draconian and very authoritarian. With great glee, many people in the community wanted to tell everyone else what they should do, how they should mask, and various other things that just revealed to me that Australian culture was not quite rebellious. It was nothing like the United States. There was no culture of the individual so much. It was very collectivist. And I had great difficulty. I was sort of tongue-in-cheek at the time, said that this may be because a large proportion of the Australian population, being an ex-convict nation, where many times convict ships arrived over many decades from the United Kingdom to Australia, transporting their prisoners to here, so we're a prisoner island, that most of us now, or a large number of us, are descended either from the convicts themselves or those who jailed them. And so in either case, we're quite comfortable with living in a kind of a prison. And so we were happy to have the authority of government be overbearing, because it was as if we'd inherited some kind of cultural meme down through the generations that we still live with today. You know, it's like, govern me harder, daddy kind of thing. We seem to love that. And so too with the ban here. We'll ban anything. You know, we banned vaping recently, or at least we made it exceedingly difficult to get vapes, all because of the authoritarian overreach in the first instance of the health officials and the doctors who advise government on these things, and then the governments, because the governments always like to say, we're just following expert advice. So even though, for example, if a person is addicted to regular cigarettes, one very useful way of trying to get off the extremely dangerous regular tobacco cigarettes is to transition to vaping and then perhaps off it altogether. They banned the vapes, not the cigarettes, they banned the vapes. And so now the only way to get a vape, as far as I'm aware, is you go to the doctor, and then from the doctor you can go to the pharmacist and get your vape to try and get off regular cigarettes. In other words, they've put barriers in the way, obstacles in the way. They've made it more difficult for a person who is addicted to regular cigarettes to move to something less dangerous. Why? Because some doctors just said that, you know, the vapes are not without harm. And whoever thought anything is without harm ever? Water is harmful if not used correctly. You could drown.
Yeah, that's a point. What would you like parents to do as this ban comes into place?
Have a discussion with their children, talk it through. There'll be some pushback, but this is the law. We expect compliance. And parents overwhelmingly have said to me that they really welcome this leadership and that they've been concerned. It is from parents as well as from some children as well that has determined this reform.
Yes, yeah, of course, if you're the government and you're making legislation, you can always point to some people, and perhaps it is a majority in this case as well, especially in terms of the parents saying they want this, because they've been taught, the parents have been taught that social media is an evil, or they see it as an evil, or they regret that their children are not behaving as they did when they were younger. When they were younger, as they were saying before, they were outside and doing all this other stuff. And I'm sure their parents complained about them. So our grandparents complained about our parents, and so on it goes all the way back to, you know, Socrates complaining about the youngsters and the youth. Or, you know, this is a tale as old as time. The older generations complain about the younger generations. Okay, so here we are now in a circumstance where technology has arrived on the scene pretty fast, changed the culture of nations and indeed of the way in which parents interact with their children, and the parents aren't happy about it. They want their children to have the same childhood that they had, regardless of what the child thinks about this. Now, of course, you can find some children who will utter the words, "We agree with you, Prime Minister, we think social media should be banned." And I've seen a number of occasions where the Prime Minister has spoken to school kids and groups and stuff. And of course, the good kids in these schools, they want approval. They want approval from their teachers and from their parents. And of course, if the Prime Minister turns up to your school and says, "What do you think about the legislation?" more often than not, the child is going to say, "Yes, of course, you want to have the approval of the Prime Minister." In one case, I think there was a girl who may have said she doesn't think it would work, but that's the only time. The overwhelming majority of children who surround the Prime Minister when he talks about this are those who've been vetted, of course, they're going to say the right things, and those who we know are going to be desperate for the approval of someone in as high an office as the Prime Minister. So it's really irrelevant that he can point to most parents or that he can point to some children being interested in this. Government should pass legislation based upon good explanations. There should be a good explanation as to why. At the moment, the explanation is some very tiny number of children get bullied. And, well, okay, there are many ways to avoid bullying. One way that won't avoid the bullying is to ban just a select number of apps, because children will migrate to other apps where the bullying will continue. So you might very well say, let's go the full Jonathan Haidt. He's the psychologist who thinks that children shouldn't have mobile phones or technology basically at all. If you went the whole hog and just banned computers and smartphones and other devices from children altogether, that still wouldn't eliminate bullying either. It would take the bullying from online to offline. And that's always been the case. You can't, unfortunately, eliminate bullying by banning things. You have to change the ideas. The bullies are still going to be there, and they'll find a way to bully. This doesn't stop that. It just hurts all children, but in particular, the good kids, the kids who aren't the bullies and the kids who want to have, let's say, a diverse look at the news and information that's out there.
What about the children? What's your message to Australian children?
I had the pleasure of welcoming a young 12-year-old Tasmanian to my office just a couple of weeks ago, young Flossie. And what Flossie had done is, with her peers, she had a whiteboard and she was encouraging them to write down what they could do instead of being on their devices. Play sport, learn a musical instrument, read a book, talk.
Do you think Flossie provided any great insight to any of her peers? Do you think Flossie was just really keen to be seen as a good girl by the Prime Minister and teachers and being mentioned by name so that she could have the kudos that she gets? Play a musical instrument. I mean, who is learning anything from this? Every child knows there's something else they could be doing apart from being on their device, but they choose to be on their device because that's what they want to do. And the child who goes outside chooses to go outside because that's what they want to do. And adults will make value judgments about what they think is better. In a distant future, which is ever more online and surrounded by technology, a child who is now prevented from using that technology is going to be at a disadvantage, because there will always be somewhere that children have more access, more freedom, more liberty. And those children in the long run will have an advantage over those who are censored or prohibited by legislation from accessing information, accessing certain apps. You might think this is not a big deal, and what do you care? Well, it's not up to you. It's up to the child who would like to have the same advantage that kids in the United States get to enjoy.
With actually communicate and develop those human relations with their friends. What we know is that the schools who banned mobile phones during class have seen better educational outcomes, but they've also seen less stress, less mental health issues, better communication because kids are actually playing.
Yep, some schools have banned mobile phones. And sometimes some schools where their usual academic results on written tests and that kind of thing were in the toilet, were terrible, were just behind all the other schools, and they ban mobile phones, and it goes up because the children don't have any other option or any other thing to do. But they're the rare exception. Most of the schools that have banned the phones have been private schools whose results were already high and showed a marginal increase. And this is just on these particular standardized tests that the government runs. And the standardized tests the government runs include, for example, writing tasks and various testing of skills that may or may not be important in the future. What will likely be important in the future is proficiency at using technology, proficiency at being able to communicate with your peers using particular technology and certain apps. So he talks there about saying that, oh, children should actually talk to one another. They do. They use a thing called social media in order to do that. This does not stop them from being able to talk face to face. I saw this often at schools that I taught at, where devices were permitted, mobile phones were permitted at lunchtime. Yes, sure, some kids sometimes were on their devices and just scrolling through their phones. Others were having conversations. It depends upon the individual personality. A one-size-fits-all thing is not going to work here. And yet no one is denying that for some people, sometimes social media can be a real problem, like anything else. Some people can work out too much. Some people eat too much junk food and it's unhealthy. Some people never exercise. So on it goes. There's all sorts of things that people can make bad choices. But the problem is, if you're not allowed to make the choice in the first place, you can't learn that there might be better choices to make. In this case, taking away the devices doesn't mean that you learn any strategy for what to do if you feel yourself being lured into spending too much time by your own lives on these devices. So it may very well be swings and roundabouts. On the one hand, children who go through these schools where the technology has been banned might show a marginal increase in test scores, which mean absolutely nothing. These are not like the final tests or anything like that. It's not like the end of school. These are just at the end of year 8, the end of year 10 in particular, schools have to, in Australia, sit these compulsory tests. Every child has to sit compulsory exams in things like literacy and numeracy or maths, English, science, so on and so forth. They used to grade some of these tests. I imagine, maybe if you banned mobile phones and whatever and you just taught to the test and you had kids rote learn, then the test scores would go up. Of course, the child coming out of such a school, when set against a child who was allowed to go to a school where they were using mobile phones in many lessons and understanding how to use different apps and maybe understanding how to do coding and just all ways in which social media and large language models and AI and that kind of thing can be used through a mobile phone. Maybe those kids will be more successful, the ones that have been using the technology over and over again as compared to the ones who went to a school where it was banned. Where would you want your child to go? The school of the future or the school where we pretend that we're living back in the 1980s?
With each other and talking with each other.
Would you like to see all schools do that? All schools ban phones?
I absolutely would.
And is there some way you can do that through legislation, or is that too heavy-handed?
I know I'm pausing this a lot, but isn't it interesting here also the kind of the horseshoe theory on technology? he's from the progressive side, and he wants social media banned. Now, if he investigated his own psychology and his own motivations for this, who knows what it would be, okay? What he's vocalizing is, I care about children. I want to stop, children harming themselves, that kind of thing. I'm compassionate for their parents and for children who are suffering from bullying. Okay, whatever the case, he wants social media banned, and it may very well also include, although he would never admit this, censoring certain channels of information where he thinks there might be too libertarian a culture going on, too many pro-capitalist ideas, too much freedom of expression, that kind of thing. He wants to censor that, or his side of politics, the memes that sort of control his side of politics and that kind of thing. So on the one hand, you have that progressive side of politics wanting to ban the technology or curtail the use of the technology. And on the other, you have the conservatives, who, of course, are always appealing to the past. So the conservative opposition here in Australia is thinking back to the good old days of the 80s and the 90s, where people weren't using technology so much, and they were having face-to-face conversations, as the Prime Minister said. They're thinking with rose-coloured glasses of their school days and how wonderful they were, and if only we could go back to that time, then children would all be sitting in rows, learning reading, writing, and arithmetic, and not being bothered with this silly technology. It'd be far better if things went back in time. That's the conservative argument for being anti-technology. In any case, all sides of government, all sides of the parliament, I should say, are basically anti-technology. There's almost no one who's super pro-technology. Even the politicians that I really respect, and of which there are a few, and the academics that I have some respect for, of which there are a few, even they are very anti-technology when it comes to children using the technology.
Well, it's largely through the states, and most state governments have done that. And schools that have done it have found it's better for teachers.
Of course it's better for
teachers. But most importantly, it's better for students.
We know the kids are smart. They'll get around this, and you accept that. Are you worried at all that this might force some kids into the darker reaches of the internet? They'll go way off, into those recesses, a bit like, the tobacco wars. They'll find some place, some black market, and some hideous website to become involved in.
No, it's important that this is about compliance, and this is the law. This isn't a voluntary thing. And of course, like anything, we ban children from going into a pub until they're 18. Doesn't mean that occasionally there might be a 16 or 17-year-old.
So he's completely evaded there the question that was asked. The question that was asked was, if you ban these particular apps, these particular sites and so on, might the children end up on some even worse dark recess of the internet, whatever that might mean? So let's take that seriously for a moment. So the child who wants to get on Facebook but can't because it's banned, or on Reddit where they used to spend a lot of time posting, they can't because it's banned, or going onto YouTube but they can't because it's banned now and they can't watch the videos or consume the political, philosophical, scientific content and learn what they wanted to. They can't go on TikTok, they can't go on Twitch. All this time they spent doing that, but they're still allowed to go on the internet, okay, just the stuff that's not banned, which is the overwhelming majority of the rest of the internet, right? So you may very well find yourself on apps where there are more dubious conversations being had, maybe where there is more anti-Jew content, anti-Israel content, anti-Western content, all that sort of stuff in apps I'm not even aware of. Parts of the, these dark recesses of the internet, as the reporter there mentioned. But the Prime Minister completely ignored that question. He just said, this is about compliance. But the point is, if you are complying with the legislation, then what? What if you end up in some place that is worse by the lights of the government or the bureaucrats who have listed these particular apps and not others? You can't list all the apps because new apps are being created all the time, and no government can respond quickly enough. No government is agile enough to respond to the second by second changes that go on the internet.
Society is saying this is what is acceptable, and we do accept that there will be non-perfection here, but we expect compliance. This is the law.
So, Prime Minister, you've been to a lot of international forums this year, a lot. So this must have been a topic of discussion with other leaders. What have they asked you about this? What's their interest?
See the smile? He loves it. He loves it. He's been to a lot of international forums. He wants global relevance. He wants to be steering the conversation. He wants to be world leading. So what have other world leaders said? This is just so important to him. It's really, really important to him that he is seen as something more than just the Prime Minister of Australia. He wants to change the world, whether for good or bad is relevant. He just wants to change the world, be significant.
It sure is, and this is world leading, but the world is following Australia. We've seen countries like Denmark, New Zealand announce that they are moving in this direction.
Malaysia now.
Malaysia, right around Asia, North America, South America, Europe, all following this example. The President of South Africa raised it with me.
That beacon of democracy and capitalism and freedom that is South Africa. The most anti-Semitic government on earth. He's holding that up. He's holding that up. Oh, I'm so proud that the South Africans are praising me for our regime of censorship.
When we had the meeting as well at the G20, countries are looking at this because this is a universal problem and it has having an effect on a child in France.
There's no such thing as a universal problem. Problems are parochial. All problems are parochial. Even if it was to affect a large number of governments around the world or whatever you might say, it's not universal. And it's just not true. It's not even universal within Australia. If the problem is bullying online on certain social media apps, it's not a problem for everyone who uses those apps, not even everyone under the age of 16. It is a small proportion, especially who experience severe forms of bullying. Bullying is experienced by almost every child, but not every child, and not to the same degree, and not in the same places. You can't legislate against bullying insofar as you already have certain kinds of legislation which more than do the job enough. For example, the crime of assault is a crime, and people can get prosecuted for that.
In Denmark, in Malaysia, in Australia, New Zealand, the same. And so governments are responding to the feelings that are coming through from children, from parents, from community-based organisations.
We're responding to the feelings, What kind of argument is that? We're responding to your feelings. Why don't we have an understanding of what the feelings are? Okay, parents are afraid. All right, now what's the source of that? Well, we're afraid that little Jane and little Johnny are going to get bullied online. Okay, here's some things you can do. Perhaps ensure that Jane and Johnny know that they are worthwhile people, that what the bullies say is not true, that they should have a good, strong group of friends, that they can leave the conversation anytime they want. They can report to any adult or other authority what bullying is happening. All of this stuff could be done, is done already. But responding to feelings, to a just general nebulous idea of fear and concern out there in the community will not help you solve it, because you can't legislate for fear. You can only do specific things. This will, again, unfortunately, if you happen to be in the circumstance where you may have lost a child because of some bullying, this particular thing, I would argue, will not have saved your child, awful as that sounds, because it will go deeper into the child's psychology, their susceptibility to words that are said to them, and those words would have been said on some other platform. They may have been said also in real life.
From health experts as well, the great thing, if we allow kids to be kids and get out there on the sporting fields, which is what we want to see happen.
Again, if you're concerned about, for example, death and injury, which is what he's implying by, having a social media ban, we're concerned about death. That's the implication here. Injury and death happens on the sporting field. But no one is going to argue that the upside of sporting, in a sense, outweighs that. People understand the risk in the same way that people understand the risk of getting on the roads. So people should have an understanding, go in with the full knowledge of what social media means without banning it, understanding there's bullying that may happen there. And so that should be the stance that is taken in the same way it's taken with respect to the risk on the sporting field as well. Life is risk. Problems are inevitable. You can't just try and avoid the problem. The problem is there. Banning it does not have any effect on the actual problem. Banning social media apps does not have any effect on bullying.
And get out there engaging with each other, is that they'll get those social skills that you only get from this face-to-face discussion.
Yes, children are still having face-to-face discussion. I don't know who he's talking about, who he has in mind. There may be some tiny percentage of kids who don't have face-to-face discussions, but everyone develops that. Another useful skill these days is, of course, being able to communicate online. There's a whole culture online about what to do, how to avoid getting in flame wars, why trolling is a bad idea, how to be polite and to foster a fruitful discussion online is a skill. Typing in the way that kids do on Snapchat or on TikTok and so on, then various messaging apps that they use. They have their own culture that they should want to develop as well. So there are many skills to develop here. He's talking about, again, this is a very sort of conservative argument. It's like people don't know how to talk to each other in face-to-face anymore. It's just not true. There have always been introverted kids. There always will be introverted kids. This is the nature of humanity. We're all very different people.
Is better than us texting each other. That's how you learn and mature into an adult as well. So this will have benefits for our economy because people will learn those skills.
That's really grasping at straws now. This will help our economy. How good is that argument? The economy of the future is unpredictable, but it will be based upon ideas and knowledge. That knowledge and those ideas will be mediated by technology, in particular social media and AI and the smartphone, the devices. The very thing that this Prime Minister, the government and the broader intelligentsia are saying is the problem. If he really thinks that this is going to benefit the economy, well, this is his understanding of the economy, right? He also thinks that renewable energy is great for the economy while everyone's electricity bills go up and the electricity infrastructure becomes more and more unreliable and Australia gets more and more into debt. He wouldn't know a good economic argument if it fell from the sky and struck him on the head. This idea that taking away technology and the skill of using technology, in particular the skill of using technology on certain apps, is actually going to improve the economy because children will have less knowledge of those apps than they otherwise would have because they're developing the skill of how to talk. Even if that was true, it's not true because children talk anyway. It's not like I don't see many mutes walking around. The kids that I see around my area that come out of school, they're all talking to each other. They're all quite good at talking to each other. I know kids that talk to each other, but this truly is desperate. In a world where across the globe, in other nations, people will have children, adolescents, young adults growing up in societies where social media is just a given, certain apps are just a given, the culture that exists online and the way that people interact online is just a given. People learn that as a matter of course growing up. That's the economy of the future. What Australia is doing is saying, except for our young people will be stymied in their capacity to understand this media. New forms of media, the existing social media, we're taking that away from them. They're not allowed to use it anymore. And so in the future, when, for example, their job requires them to be able to use this stuff and be extremely proficient in being able to use this stuff, they will be behind some number of years. Do you think that helps the economy? I don't know how that helps the economy.
When you're a young person growing up, part of your development is reading and learning the skills, arithmetic, English skills, all of that, science.
Technology, AI, apps, smartphones.
But it's also about human interaction is so important.
Not all countries are happy with this, though.
Human interaction, which includes human interaction online, which will just become more and more important as time goes on, I guess.
We've seen the messages coming from the Congress in the US about it being censorship. There's a sense that Donald Trump isn't a big supporter. What do you say to the US?
Of course, there's guy Mark Riley. He can't stand Donald Trump. Channel 7 can't stand Donald Trump. Anything that happens in the United States is basically they're a land of idiots. And, aren't we so much more intelligent? Here in Australia, we're able to censor things. Over there, they've got this ridiculous thing, the First Amendment. They're crazy libertarians or crazy capitalists, all this sort of stuff. So that's the theme that sort of goes underneath that question. And it's pervasive throughout Australia. There is no objectivity when it comes to discussing the United States, discussing US administrations, and in particular, of course, Donald Trump.
What we say is that we're a sovereign nation and we have made this decision as a country and it has overwhelming support. And standing up for parents, children, families, and the national interest is what my job is.
Appeal to emotion, again. And it's worth saying here as well, and this is one of the great problems with the legislation, is that if a child does gain access, although it's prohibited, there is no punishment prescribed. So nothing will happen to a child who is caught, accessing YouTube when they shouldn't and Reddit when they shouldn't. So exactly what the stick is, so to speak, what the concern that a child should have about trying to gain access to this should be, I don't know. The only punishment prescribed in the legislation is that if the social media companies do not take sufficient measures to actually prevent young people from getting onto their platforms, the ones that are named, then they can be fined massively. Massive fine. So the only punishment that exists in the legislation for anyone here is against the social media companies because we're anti-business, we're anti-corporation, and we're turning over enforcement, which is normally a police issue, to the social media companies. And if they don't perform the police function well enough, they don't actually police their own platforms, then they will be punished by the government. Parents apparently won't get punished, although they could get punished by the platforms by having their own accounts taken away. So if they knowingly provide their passwords or whatever to their children, and parents will have their accounts taken away as well, so they'll be punished by the platforms, and the platforms will do that for fear that the government might fine them. I'll go through a little bit of the legislation in just a moment.
We are, in a big way, the canary in the coal mine, though, aren't we, for the world? Do you feel that pressure?
I feel that honour. I'm really proud of what we're doing here, and all Australians should be proud. This is us taking back control.
Well, we hope it works, Prime Minister. Good luck.
It will.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
He's really proud. He's desperate to appear relevant on the global stage. He doesn't just want to be Prime Minister of Australia. He wants to be regarded as some sort of world leader. So here we have which of the platforms are age restricted, as they say. And so if you're under 16, you cannot go on Facebook, Instagram, Kik, Reddit, Snapchat, Threads, TikTok, Twitch, X, Twitter, or YouTube. But what you can go on is Discord, GitHub, Google Classroom, Lego Play, Messenger, interestingly enough, because you can have groups on Messenger, right? You have groups and you can have individuals talking one to another. Pinterest, Roblox, Steam and Steam Chat, WhatsApp, YouTube Kids. So WhatsApp and Messenger, but the reason I mention that is because if the concern from parents is, and by extension government, bullying online, And what tends to happen in a school is a school will have a particular culture. The students at the school will have a particular culture. Now, the reason that's relevant is because, maybe previously, like most of the cohort in year 8 at a particular school will be on Snapchat together, and that's where they communicate, or they'll be on Facebook or something, or whatever. They'll be on something. Now, if the other ones have been banned, then they'll just migrate to something that is permitted, like Messenger. And so most of the school will be there, and you and your friends, you'll contact each other on Messenger. If there's a group that's made in Messenger, then of course that group, individuals within that group could be still subject to bullying, online bullying via social media. So it hasn't done anything. It's just moved it from one place to another. So it's completely and utterly irrational. Nothing about this makes any sense at all. Okay, so this is just from the sort of from the eSafety Commissioner. Okay, so in Australia, sometimes she's called the E-Karen, Julie Inman Grant, who ironically is actually part American. She's half American. She's a dual citizen. She speaks with an American accent. It's just weird to have our chief censor in Australia be from the land of the free, the home of the brave. But she is constantly out there, spruiking this legislation. So, as I was saying, there's no penalty for a child, actually, if the under 16-year-old actually does go onto YouTube and watches stuff or goes onto Facebook or whatever. There's no penalty for them. It's unclear whether or not there would be a penalty for their parents who maybe let them go on. Their parents could be penalised by the platform by having their account shut down, for example. But the penalty that does exist, as we shall see here, it says under here, key measures under the new law, new penalties. So this is the only people who can be penalised for breaches of this are in fact the social media companies themselves. It says a court can order civil penalties for platforms that don't take reasonable steps to prevent underage users from having accounts on their platforms. This includes court-imposed fines of up to 150,000 penalty units for corporations, currently equivalent to a total of 49.5 million Australian dollars. So you can see this is a deeply, deeply anti-corporation, anti-business. It's designed to punish the corporations. And they didn't do anything wrong, but it means that they put in place things like facial recognition technology. You're supposed to, if you're a young person under the age of 16, in order to have an account, you have to show your face, prove that you're above the age of 16. And of course, in Australia, that kind of means, by extension, anyone who opens an account on any of these platforms now, including adults, will have to show their ID and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So the only people we're punishing with the legislation officially that has penalties associated are the businesses, but everyone else, even if you're not doing anything wrong, gets penalised in a sense. You've got to go through the time and effort of proving you are who you are. But we've already seen though that kids are quite easily getting around these restrictions anyway. You can hold up a photo of an older person. You can have someone else use their face. Some kids apparently, according to the facial recognition technology that determines whether or not you're under the age of 16, have been told they're over the age of 16, and so they've legitimately got an account anyway, although they might have to set their birth date to something that is dishonest, so set it to a different year. So this is what animates our government, censorship, cracking down on the way in which people communicate. It's broader than just being worried about hate speech. It's the attempt to prevent people communicating for fear they might be bullied, that kind of thing. The person who is above the E-Karen, the eSafety Commissioner, who is the bureaucrat in charge of policing the internet here, literally it's like a chief censor. Initially, the position was created in order to help prevent online bullying, but now it just extends itself out to literally anything that the eSafety Commissioner does not like, or the people in that office do not like, in terms of, could be just what they regard as misinformation and disinformation. Anyone who objects to the narrative on climate change or energy policy, that kind of thing, may very well have their Facebook post flagged for extremist content by the eSafety Commissioner. The elected official who is ostensibly above her is known as Annika Wells, MP, and she is posting about the tragedy at Bondi Beach. So the tragedy at Bondi Beach is shocking and distressing. Last night, the eSafety Commissioner stood up their on-call team to monitor what's being shared online. If you see violent, harmful or distressing footage or photos online, don't share it further, even if your intention is to help raise awareness. You may cause distress to others. So we are more concerned about possibly causing distress to others than raising awareness. Again, this is the whole problem with the idea of censorship. Do we censor information about Bondi to the point where it's just memory hold? We don't know about it, or we regard it as just a sad tragedy like the Port Arthur massacre was. We're not allowed to talk about what might have motivated, for example, the shooters, or who their victims were, let's say, if they were of a particular community. All of that might be regarded by the eSafety Commissioner as a kind of hate that we should want to avoid. It's remarkable. Before the tragedy, not only was this the biggest story, the other biggest story at the time was Annika Wells, that same communications minister, has been seen to have been reaching into the till, so to speak, to fund family holidays using the taxpayer dime. Many times when politicians travel, I think it's quite legitimate that, they maybe travel by business class and maybe sometimes they can take their family, but this person was going to sporting events and just generally having a great old time, living it up on the largesse of the Australian taxpayer. Champagne socialists, these people are sometimes called. So we've got her, and as I say, the irony of having Julie Inman-Grant, which the eSafety Commissioner is it's almost like what you would expect in China or in Russia or something like that. This person who is just watching the internet on the behalf of the government and for the purpose of safety is monitoring posts that are being made. I guess in this sense, America's loss is our gain. I think it's the other way around, actually. Our loss is your gain, America, in this case with Julie Inman-Grant. What Australia is doing here, with that post there about not sharing things online about the Bondi massacre, they're attempting to censor reality, censor the internet. So the public, whether they're young people or they're adults, so they cannot see what happened if they are really interested in seeing what happened, seeing the reality of what happened. They're trying to sanitize things. It would be as if they were to do an audit on all those history textbooks and decide we should remove pictures of the Holocaust. We're going to whitewash history. Take away pictures of the gas chambers. That's extremist, hateful content. Take away pictures of dead bodies and the emaciated survivors. Prevent people seeing that, because they might actually draw conclusions about what happened, just as they draw conclusions about what happened if they see images of hurt people at Bondi, or if there's any discussion about that as well. So censoring. The Prime Minister was there appealing to emotion throughout that entire interview, appealing to anecdote rather than, large. It's bad enough to appeal to just general statistics, but here he was just appealing to anecdote. Now and again he would say, they wouldn't give specifics, but he would just say, many parents have come up to me, many. And he used, is that a majority of parents? We don't know. I guess that it is, but still making policy on the basis of anecdote and feeling is not something you'd hope the government would do. Of course, as he says as well, one death is too many. Of course it is. Whether it's because of a child being bullied online, or whether it's because of a head injury at football, or a drowning in swimming class, or while surfing, or getting lost in the bush while going for a walk, or being killed in a road accident. There are many times when one death is too many, and there are myriad possible hazardous activities one can engage in. Social media is just one such. And there are many ways to mitigate that. Banning won't do it, but mitigating might be done by, the one thing I do agree with Anthony Albanese on, is if parents have conversation with their children, but they can do that before the ban. They don't need a ban in order to do that. And the ban is only for specific apps. So if Jack is bullying Johnny on, up until now on TikTok, well, now they're allowed to move to any other app, literally any other app that's not in that list. And Jack can still bully Johnny. I regard all of this as a kind of intergovernmental virtue signalling by Australia, and also virtue signalling to parents. But the virtue signalling from our government to other governments, I mean, it's a constant, it's a theme with this particular government. They want to be seen as world leading. The climate change attributed to fossil fuels. Okay, so their response is ban coal-fired power stations. We're not allowed to build any more coal-fired power stations. The governments across Australia are banning the building of them, letting them fall into disrepair and attempting to pull up the slack with solar panels and wind farms. And they want to be seen on the world stage to be leading the world when it comes to renewable energy. We want to be a renewable energy superpower, says the government, whatever that means, even though we sit on a bed of coal. We want to be world leading when it comes to e-cigarettes, vaping, because there are some bad effects sometimes for some people when they use e-cigarettes. So we ban them. And in those cases, such bans just result in a black market. We also make taxes on regular cigarettes are exceedingly high. So now there is a burgeoning black market in illegal cigarettes that come in from Asia without having to pay the taxes. As I say, social media, it's a means of communication. So it's a means of knowledge sharing, fun, collaboration, and so on. Bullying is not the only thing that goes on social media. Children learn things there, and they learn how to communicate. He was very concerned, the Prime Minister was very concerned to be apparently concerned about children losing the ability to communicate. This does nothing but takes away from children who are natural introverts, who don't like necessarily talking that much, takes away from them a tool that they could use that they're comfortable with in order to communicate. Maybe some of them are developing the ability to write pithy tweets. Well, no longer. Maybe some children have burgeoning YouTube channels where they create content. I think there are a number of children who have been affected in an extremely negative way. They were creating content on YouTube and TikTok and various other places and may have had significant followings for a person under the age of 16, and those accounts are shut down. That must have caused great distress, devastation even to those children, however few they were. But I imagine however few they were, they outnumbered the number of children who suffered the most severe forms of bullying. People who are supportive of the ban heavily weight, for want of another word, the negatives. They emphasize the negatives. Basically ignore the positives or minimize any of the positives. And attempting to say that this would be economically advantageous for Australia, absurd, illogical, because the future economy will depend increasingly on technology and on people's ability and children's ability to learn to use it. I imagine this will fail. It seems to already be failing. Children are getting around it. And insofar as they're getting around it, they're keeping quiet about it. So it's not going to achieve what they want, even though these things are banned. And I don't know that the social media companies have any means by which they can actually figure out who exactly is online and provide data that is accurate to the government, that, this number of people, and why would it be in their interest to anyway, this number of people under the age of 16 actually got access to our platform. Are they going to admit that? Likely not. I imagine it's going to fail, but the government will commission some kind of study, or someone will do a study which has all sorts of facts and figures in there, and they will cherry pick the ones that make it appear as if this particular ban is good, and they'll report it to the UN and other large bodies, and I imagine some other countries might take it on. So this may well come to a jurisdiction near you. Likely not the federal government of the United States, but perhaps some of the more left-leaning states in the United States could try and implement this. The UK might try and implement this as well. But in the meantime, Australia just becomes, for our children, just a little more like the Hermit Kingdom, more like North Korea. Different in degree, sure, but not in kind. we're restricting access to information. We're cutting off some channels. And North Korea has all their channels cut off except for their intranet. So we now have Julie Inman-Grant, the eSafety Karen, or the eSafety Commissioner's intranet here in Australia for people under the age of 16. And for everyone else, prove your identity if you want to go online and use certain apps. Now, actually, I found the place here where it says it's not a ban, it's a delay to having accounts. This means there will be no penalties for under 16s who access an age-restricted social media platform or for their parents or carers. However, age-restricted social media platforms may face penalties if they don't take reasonable steps to prevent under 16s from having accounts. That's a remarkable sort of phrase. That's as if to say, if you have a house and the burglar breaks in, then you're going to be punished because the security on your house was not great enough. So the social media platforms, if they aren't able to keep the children off and the children do get on, then they can be punished. So if the burglar breaks in, never mind, there's no penalty for the burglar, but there's a penalty for you because your security system or your door or whatever it is wasn't strong enough to keep them out. But as we say, all this under 16-year-old needs to do is lie. They can just lie and they can get onto these things. There's any number of ways you can get around it. But if you're a child who's got a morality that says you shouldn't break the law, then you're at a disadvantage. So honest kids are at a disadvantage. As I say, I think Atlas should shrug. These companies should just kind of let Australia wither for a little while. It's all very silly. And in the wake of the Bondi massacre, it's cutting off information channels where, especially as we move into the summer break here, so it's coming up to Christmas time and children have 6 weeks off school, thank goodness. They will see each other face to face, but, the ones that want to go online and learn about recent events and have philosophical and political discussions, the places where they can go to actually have these discussions have now been restricted on the basis of very poor arguments made by the Prime Minister there in an attempt to justify his policy of censorship, to be seen to be doing something to respond to the feelings of parents out there. We'll see what happens. I don't expect it will be successful. And in the meantime, we have far bigger fish to fry. But he will, of course, I think, come back to this kind of legislation and be talking about the successes to it, because his failures have been so monumental recently in terms of security and in protecting the Jewish people, that trying to regard this censoring of the internet as a great success will be one thing he'll be able to hold up and say that he's done something, he's succeeding, look at how wonderful his government is. He's protecting the children going online and seeing hate, generic hate. Okay, that'll have to do me for now. I think we've spoken enough about Anthony Albanese. I shall attempt to return to regular programming again very soon. Until then, bye-bye.